Hello, welcome to the channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and don't forget to write a comment. Enjoy watching.
My dad said he was too busy to come to my award ceremony. Then he posted a selfie from a nail salon with my little sister, wearing matching flower crowns. It wasn't the first time I'd felt invisible, but that day it hit like a brick to the teeth. You know that kind of pain where your body doesn't even react right away? You just sit there, too stunned to blink, your brain catching up second by second to what just happened. That was me, sitting in the third row of folding chairs in our overcrowded high school gym, clutching a copy of my speech and staring at my phone like it had betrayed me. Because it had, in a way. It showed me a truth I'd been trying to ignore for 17 long years. Rick Thompson, he always insisted we call him Rick, never Dad, unless we were in public or around family friends, was the kind of man who'd buy a car before paying off the broken washing machine. He was charming, loud, and good with kids, which is something people say about grown men who know how to high-five and bribe children with candy. He loved being the fun parent, the exciting one, the one with the weekend plans and spontaneous road trips, but only for my sister Maddie. With me, everything had conditions. Everything had strings. He and my mom divorced when I was 9, but we all still lived in the same house, technically. They couldn't afford to separate fully. It was awkward and strange, like a sitcom where the laugh track died halfway through the season. My mom worked 2 jobs and mostly kept to herself and Rick. Rick made being home feel like walking on eggshells dipped in oil. You never knew what mood you were getting, and if you guessed wrong, you were the problem. Maddie, for years younger than me, could do no wrong in his eyes. She was the light of his life, his baby girl, his mini-me. They had matching sweatshirts, inside jokes, their own Spotify playlist. He once let her skip school to go to a concert with him in another city. When I asked if I could go to a writing workshop the same month, he said we didn't have the gas money. He said it with a straight face while showing off pictures of them at the event like it was a family vacation. So when the school sent out the invitation for the academic awards night, and I found out I was getting the full-ride scholarship, the only one in my class, by the way, I wasn't naive. I didn't expect a marching band or a bouquet. I just wanted him there. That's all. 1 hour. A seat in the back. A nod. Maybe a small, awkward smile. Anything to acknowledge that I'd clawed my way to something good, something stable, without ever asking him for help. Mom had flown out 2 days earlier to take care of her sick mother in Arizona, so it was just Rick and Maddie at home. The day of the ceremony, I reminded him in the morning. He mumbled something about a packed afternoon. I texted him at 4:30. Still coming tonight? It's at 6. I go up around 6:30. He replied 5 minutes later. Super swamped. I owe you one. Kill it out there. I stared at the text for a full minute. No, sorry. No, I wish I could be there. Just that trademark Rick energy, breezy and casual, like this was some open mic night, and not the moment I'd spent 4 years grinding for. 10 minutes later, I opened Instagram without thinking. Just muscle memory. There he was, smiling under fluorescent lighting, holding up a peace sign while Maddie flashed her new glitter-coated nails. The caption read, "Self-care Sunday, on a Thursday. Gotta spoil my girl #daddy-daughter time." She had a flower crown on. So did he. They looked like they were about to audition for a shampoo commercial. I stared at that picture like it was written in a language I used to speak. And then I stopped feeling. That's the only way I can explain it. I stopped feeling. My heart didn't sink. It didn't shatter. It just locked up, like a safe that slammed shut. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't even show my friends. I just sat there, blinking at that screen while my classmates giggled around me, someone passed out mints, and the AV guy yelled about feedback into the mic. I folded the speech in my lap. Then I folded something else in my head, something harder to explain. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was the last thread holding together the idea that if I just worked harder, I'd be seen, valued, loved. I looked up at the gymnasium lights, those big round ones that flicker and hum when no one's talking. I thought about how I'd practiced my speech in front of the mirror all week. I thought about how I used to leave sticky notes on Rick's door when I was 10, telling him about my day because he never asked. I thought about how I deleted them myself a year later when I realized he wasn't saving any of them. And then I made a decision. A small one, maybe? But small decisions can echo. They always tell you to speak from the heart. So that night, I decided I would. But not the way they expected. The room was buzzing with that particular nervous energy you only feel right before something important starts, like a school play or a graduation or the kind of award ceremony where parents shift uncomfortably in metal chairs, pretending not to check their phones every few seconds. I was sitting dead center in the second row with the other honorees, trying to smooth the crease out of my skirt and not look like my stomach was turning inside out. Teachers smiled at me as they passed, offering encouraging nods, whispering little congratulations, telling me I deserved it. I smiled back politely, said thank you, nodded on cue, and all the while my mind was playing the same scene on loop. Rick's smug grin under that stupid flower crown, Maddie's sparkly nails, and that damn Instagram caption pretending that all was right in our shiny little world. They called my name with that drawn-out, proud tone people use when they want the moment to land heavy. My full name: Kayla Elise Thompson. My principal leaned into the microphone, his voice echoing through the gym like we were all part of something historic. This year's highest academic achievement and full scholarship goes to a student who has not only excelled academically but shown extraordinary perseverance and quiet leadership. Applause. Some polite, some genuine. A few whistles from the back, probably from the theater kids I'd helped with homework in exchange for letting me use their printer. I walked up the steps calmly, paper still folded neatly in my hand, heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I stood behind the podium, adjusted the mic like I'd practiced, and smiled at the sea of people I wasn't sure I even knew anymore. The lights were hot, and my palms were damp, but I wasn't afraid. I felt calm, almost too calm. I opened my speech and began just as I'd rehearsed. Thank you all for being here tonight. I want to start by thanking my teachers, especially Ms. Langford, who let me rewrite my midterm essay after I cried in her office and left snot on her desk. You're a hero. The crowd laughed. It was a soft, honest laugh, the kind that made people settle into their chairs, expecting more of the same. I gave them a few more lines of gratitude. To my science teacher. To my best friend Jordan, who was tearing up and filming the whole thing. To the janitor, Mr. Carlson, who once found my flash drive in the cafeteria and returned it with a candy bar and a note that said, "Future valedictorian." It was all going according to plan. Until it wasn't. I paused. I took a breath, not for effect, but to calm the fire that had started rising in my throat. And then I stepped away from the script. I looked down at the folded paper in my hands and then set it gently on the podium, like laying a blanket over a grave. And finally, I said, voice steady, not a tremor in it, to the people who never believed in me, who were always too busy, too distracted, too wrapped up in their own lives to notice that I was drowning right in front of them. Who thought that matching flower crowns and glittery nail polish were more important than perseverance, effort, or simply showing up? The air left the gym like someone had popped a balloon with a needle. There was no coughing, no shuffling, just complete, frozen silence. I could see Ms. Langford in the front row, her mouth slightly open, her hand halfway to her chest. I could feel eyes darting around, looking for a reaction, waiting to see if this was some kind of elaborate joke. It's funny, isn't it? I said, and I gave a small, bitter smile. You can raise 2 daughters, spend 60% of your time with one, 60% with the other, and still somehow manage to miss both completely. I saw a few eyebrows go up, the kind of looks that said, wait, 60 and 60? That's not right. But nobody said anything. Not yet. They were still too stunned. I kept going. I didn't stop. I didn't stutter. Some people show love through presence and others through absence, like it's a gift to let you figure things out alone. Well, I did. I figured it out. I learned that silence doesn't protect you. It just trains people to forget you exist. I let that sit in the air. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I just looked out into the crowd and spotted Maddie in the third row, her eyes wide and glossy, her mouth tight like she was trying not to breathe too loudly. Her hand was clenching the arm of her seat, and for a second I thought she might lunge at me. But then she stood up so fast her chair scraped loud against the floor. She covered her face with one hand and ran straight down the aisle, her hair catching the lights like a signal flare. I didn't watch her leave. I didn't break. I finished with a final line, softer than the rest, but it landed like a punch. This scholarship isn't just a win. It's proof. Proof that I didn't need you to get here. But damn, I wanted you anyway. Applause didn't come right away. There was a beat, a solid, awkward, painful beat, and then Jordan started clapping slowly, loudly, defiantly. A few others joined in. Then more. Eventually, the whole gym was clapping, but it didn't sound like celebration. It sounded like release. Like they'd been holding their breath and finally let it go. I walked off the stage without looking back, hands dry, eyes dry, heart still, stone still. Outside, the air was cooler than I expected, and quiet. No phone buzzed. No dad waiting in the parking lot with the engine running and a fake apology loaded in his mouth. Just silence and the echo of everything I hadn't said until now. And that night, Rick didn't come home. Summer arrived the way it always did in our small suburban town. Too hot, too long, and heavy with the weight of days that felt stuck on repeat. The kind of summer where cicadas screamed like they were trying to drown out your thoughts, where ice melted before you could take a sip, and where people pretended time didn't exist because school was out and nobody had to pretend to care for a few months. But this summer was different, because the moment I stepped off that stage, the entire atmosphere inside our house changed into something I couldn't quite name, but could absolutely feel. Like every corner of every room had eyes now, watching and waiting for me to break. Maddie didn't speak to me once after the ceremony, not a single word, not even a muttered insult or passive comment under her breath like she used to do when we were fighting over bathroom time or TV rights. She walked past me like I was air, invisible but in the way. She slammed her door when I was near, turned up the music when I was in the hallway, and made sure her footsteps sounded louder when she knew I was downstairs. It wasn't silence born of pain, it was calculated punishment, like I'd touched something sacred and unspoken between her and Rick, and now I had to pay for the audacity. Rick, on the other hand, didn't ignore me, he just removed me from his mental calendar. He never directly spoke to me after the ceremony, but I could feel his hands in everything that changed. The car keys I'd used for 2 years without issue suddenly went missing one morning. When I asked Maddie if she'd seen them, she laughed and said maybe I should start walking, it builds character. A week later, I found out that Rick had canceled the hotel reservations for my college tour trip, one I'd scheduled and saved for on my own. He claimed we couldn't afford to go right now, even though he'd just posted a picture of Maddie on a brand new paddleboard with the caption, "Summer Adventures with My Girl." The real kicker? The paddleboard was electric. That's not even a thing people need. But I didn't yell. I didn't fight back. I didn't cry in front of them or slam a single door. I went quiet, surgical, cold, detached. I became a shadow moving through the house with purpose, but no weight, like a ghost who refused to haunt them in any way that could be named. My breakfast dishes were always washed and put away. My room stayed clean. My laptop never left the desk. I replied to questions with short, polite answers when I had to, never more than what was needed. There was a strange power in that silence, the kind that made people nervous, because they never knew what was going on inside me anymore. And I liked it that way. I'd learned a long time ago that being loud didn't get you heard in our house. When I was 10 and won first place at the science fair, I waited 3 days before reminding Rick that the trophy was still in the trunk. By the time he pulled it out, it was chipped and smelled like spilled soda. When Maddie lost her hamster the following year, Rick made flyers, went door to door and offered a $50 reward to the neighbor kids if they found it. He even cried when they didn't. I started to understand then, but I didn't really let it in until now, that I had been living in the shadows of people who liked the sound of their own importance more than the quiet strength of mine. When Mom came back from Arizona, she noticed the tension instantly. She paused in the hallway the first night, suitcase still in her hand, looking at the way Rick avoided eye contact with me and the way Maddie slammed her door without a word. She looked at me for a long time and finally said, "Everything okay?" I wanted to laugh. Not because it was funny, but because she asked it like it wasn't obvious something had fractured completely while she was gone. But I just nodded. Yeah, everything's fine. She didn't push. She never did. That's always been her way, float above the storm and pray it clears on its own. Maybe she was tired. Maybe she didn't want to know. The rest of the summer passed in slow motion. I spent my days finishing scholarship paperwork, researching schools late into the night, and making lists of what I'd pack when I left. Rick kept pretending I didn't exist, unless it was to move my laundry out of the dryer too early or to remind me I was still under his roof. Maddie kept throwing daggers with her eyes and pretending to cry louder on the phone when I walked by. I didn't respond. I didn't flinch. I just moved forward like none of it touched me. And then, in the final days of August, I packed my bags. I didn't tell them which school I was going to. I let Rick assume whatever he wanted. I let Maddie think I was bluffing. I told Mom goodbye with a long hug and whispered, "I'll text you when I get there." But I never said where there was. Not because I wanted to be cruel. Not because I wanted to punish them. But because it felt like the final piece of power I still had, and after a summer of being erased from my own life, that tiny piece of control tasted like freedom. Let them guess. Let them wonder. Let them finally sit in the silence they created. When I finally left home, I didn't cry or look back or even pause at the end of the driveway the way people do in movies when they're supposed to feel some kind of nostalgia or guilt for the years they're leaving behind. I just loaded the last box into the back of the car I'd rented using my own debit card, money I'd earned tutoring kids who didn't know the difference between mitosis and meiosis, and drove away without telling a single soul where I was headed. I'd spent years waiting for someone to care enough to ask the right questions, and when no one did, the silence became my answer. I changed my number the same night I got to my new dorm room. I didn't even save the old one in my contacts. Didn't bother with a farewell text or a dramatic voicemail. I hit block on Rick first because I knew he'd never call anyway, but it still felt like setting a fire to something toxic and watching it burn down clean. I blocked Maddie next, not because I hated her, but because I couldn't carry her guilt on my back anymore. I'd been the quiet one for too long, the one who always swallowed the tension, and now I was choosing silence not as a punishment, but as a boundary. I didn't block my mom. I left her in my contacts, untouched. But I never called. She never texted. That, too, was its own kind of answer. College was everything home wasn't loud, unpredictable, and full of people who saw me as a blank slate instead of a walking disappointment. I picked a school in a city no one in my family had ever mentioned, for states away, and settled in like I'd been born for this very moment. I introduced myself with just my first name and a smile, dropped my last name whenever I could, and started becoming someone new, someone who didn't shrink to make room for other people's comfort. I got an internship my first semester with a local journalist who said I had razor instincts and a killer sense of narrative timing. She never once asked about my family. She only cared if I met deadlines and didn't misspell politicians' names. It was perfect. I joined a student-run podcast and started writing under a pen name, tackling stories about campus scandals and administrative failures. One professor pulled me aside after an editorial went viral and said, "You have the voice of someone who's been ignored for too long. Use it." So I did. I used it on everything except the subject of home. The only time I let the past brush against me was Maddie's graduation. I bought a blank card with a minimalist design, just a black line drawing of a cap and diploma, and wrote exactly nothing inside. No message. No signature. I mailed it from a neighboring town so it wouldn't be traced and made sure there was no return address. A part of me wanted her to know I remembered. A bigger part wanted her to feel how heavy a blank card could be when it came from someone who used to know every detail of your bedtime routine. The year passed quickly, like a blur of deadlines and caffeine and late-night rooftop talks with people who didn't care that I used to be the forgotten daughter of a man who valued optics more than connection. I didn't think about Rick much, honestly. When I did, it wasn't with rage, it was with the dull ache of someone who's already buried the relationship in their mind and just occasionally trips over the headstone. It wasn't until a summer afternoon, almost exactly 1 year from the night of the speech, that I was brought back to the old version of myself without warning. I was standing in line at a bookstore downtown, flipping through a paperback, when someone behind me said my name like they were testing it out for the first time in years. I turned and saw Mrs. Hargrove, our old neighbor who used to bring over banana bread whenever she heard my parents yelling through the walls. Her smile was wide, but confused. She hugged me too long, then leaned back and gave me a once-over like she couldn't decide if I looked grown or just tired. "You dropped out, huh?" she said, laughing a little like it was an inside joke. I blinked. "What?" "Rick said you left school. Said it got too hard and you had to come back home. Shame. You were always so smart." I didn't reply right away. I just stood there holding the book like it might save me. I could feel heat climbing up my neck, not from shame, but from the slow realization that Rick had rewritten my story to fit his comfort, trimming the facts like bad branches off a tree until it looked clean and manageable. It wasn't enough that I had left. He had to paint me as the failure so no one would ask where he went wrong. I paid for the book without finishing the chapter I'd been reading and left the store without saying goodbye. My throat was dry, and my hands were shaking, not from anger, but from the quiet rage that builds when someone steals your truth and hands the world a broken version of it. A week later, I got the envelope in the mail. Thick cardstock, the kind that smells expensive and feels like someone tried way too hard to make it all seem elegant. On the front, in perfect cursive, was my full name, Ms. Kayla Thompson. It was an invitation to Maddie's Sweet 16. I held it in my hands for a long time before opening it, staring at the way my name sat on the envelope like it belonged to someone else entirely. I arrived 15 minutes late on purpose, wearing a dress that I knew would make Maddie uncomfortable, not because it was flashy or inappropriate, but because it was the kind of quiet elegance that made people ask where you'd been and what you'd done to become someone who could walk into a room like she owned every inch of her story. It wasn't red or glittery or trying too hard. It was navy blue, cut sharp at the collarbone, and paired with heels I'd bought secondhand and polished until they looked brand new. My hair was pinned back, makeup subtle, smile easy. Calm, composed, absolutely still on the inside, but I could feel my heartbeat knocking against my ribs like it wanted to run ahead of me and scream before I even opened the door. The house looked the same. Of course it did. Same tacky garden gnome by the front steps. Same creaky wooden swing that Rick swore he'd fix 4 summers ago. Same chipped mailbox with the peeling Thompson decal like a name that never quite stuck to anything solid. I walked up the driveway without slowing down, rang the bell, and waited. Maddie answered it. She was wearing a soft pink dress that matched the pastel streamers hanging from the ceiling behind her. Her makeup was heavier than mine ever was at her age, and her expression was one of tight politeness, the kind that comes with a side of barely contained disgust. She opened the door fully, not moving to hug me, not even saying my name. "You came," she said, not quite a question, not quite a welcome. "I did," I replied. "Happy birthday, Maddie." Her eyes narrowed a fraction, but she stepped aside and let me in. The house was full of people I barely recognized, family, friends, neighbors, a few of Maddie's classmates who were already scrolling through their phones while chewing whatever overpriced caterer had laid out on the table. Mom looked up from the kitchen and smiled, one of those automatic motherly smiles that don't reach the eyes when there's too much worry behind them. Rick was standing near the fireplace, drink in hand, laughing a little too loudly at something a guest had said. He turned as I entered and gave me a grin that was all teeth and no truth. "There she is," he said, arms out like nothing had happened between us. "The prodigal daughter returns." I didn't answer. I just walked past him and took a seat at the long dining table, the one we only ever used for holidays or moments that required the appearance of unity. Mom hovered, asking if I was hungry, if I was sleeping enough, if I'd kept my hair the same color, anything but the question she actually wanted to ask, which was probably, "Are you okay now?" I didn't give her anything. I let the silence stretch, just long enough to make it uncomfortable. Dinner was served with the kind of tension you can slice with a butter knife. People made small talk, asked where I was living, what I was studying, whether I still liked writing. I answered politely, vaguely, giving them just enough to chew on without ever feeding them the full story. Maddie sat across from me, stiff and controlled, her fork barely scraping the food on her plate. It wasn't until halfway through the meal that she finally broke the script. "You know," she said, her voice cutting through the clinking of silverware, "you really humiliated me at the awards night. I couldn't show my face at school for weeks. People looked at me like I was the villain. I was just a kid." I didn't flinch. I set my glass down carefully, then looked straight at her. "Imagine living like that every day," I said softly, but without apology. "For 17 years. The table went silent. Someone in the back cleared their throat. Rick's hand tensed around his drink, and Mom opened her mouth, then closed it again. Maddie's lips tightened like she was trying to swallow every emotion at once and failing miserably. I reached under the table, pulled out the small box I'd tucked into my bag, and slid it across to her. She hesitated, then opened it slowly, almost afraid. Inside was a single bottle of nail polish, the same cheap, glittery lavender shade from the photo that broke something in me for good. I watched her blink at it, eyes darting to me and then to Rick, like she couldn't decide whether this was a joke or a threat. "I figured you'd want to remember the moment Dad made his choice," I said, calmly, without venom, like stating the weather. The moment cracked. Maddie stood up so fast her chair screeched against the tile, face flushed with something between rage and shame. She shoved the box back, knocking over a glass in the process, and stormed down the hallway. I heard a door slam seconds later. Rick dropped his napkin on the table and muttered something under his breath before following her, the performance of fatherhood slipping slightly with every hurried step. The room was quiet again. The party hadn't ended, not officially, but everyone knew the tone had shifted. Conversations resumed in low murmurs, glances darted toward me and then away. I picked up my fork and calmly finished what was left on my plate. It wasn't about cruelty. It wasn't about revenge. It was about balance. It was about finally saying the thing out loud that had lived under my skin for too long. When I stood to leave, Mom followed me to the door, clutching her sweater around her like armor against the cold truth she hadn't wanted to acknowledge. "Will you ever come back home?" she asked, her voice low, not begging, but small. I didn't answer. I held her eyes for a moment, nodded once, maybe out of habit, maybe out of mercy, and walked into the night without looking back.